They said the Apache girl was dead, hung for spying, left to twist in the wind. But when one cowboy cut her down, she gasped for air. That single breath, one tiny defiance of death, would set in motion a storm of hooves and fury by dawn. Sounds like the stuff of tall tales, right? But the Old West had a way of taking quiet towns and turning them into powder kegs overnight. The settlement was hardly more than a speck in the desert. A handful of shacks, a saloon with swinging doors, a jailhouse with rusty bars, and a church steeple that looked too clean for the sins hiding underneath. Suspicion filled the air thicker than dust. Suspicion of drifters, suspicion of outlaws, and above all, suspicion of the Apache. Now, to be fair, fear wasn't born out of nothing. Raids had been real enough. Families whispered about cabins burned at night, men shot from their saddles, horses taken under moonlight. But fear has a funny way of twisting into something uglier. A rumor muttered over whiskey could turn into a death sentence before the bottle ran dry. That's exactly what happened the day she showed up. A girl, barely 17, stumbled into town barefoot, her buckskin dress frayed, her black hair tangled from days on the trail. She looked more lost than dangerous, but the townsfolk didn't see it that way. "She's scouting for her people," one rancher snapped, slamming his fist on a barrel. "She's been stealing horses," another swore, though he'd never laid eyes on her before that moment. No evidence, no trial, just fear. By late afternoon, a crowd had gathered beneath the lone cottonwood tree at the edge of town. Dust spun in lazy circles as they argued, though everyone knew which way it would end. The sheriff, a man more concerned with keeping order than keeping justice, didn't stand in their way. He had a badge pinned to his chest, but it was more ornament than authority. If the mob wanted a hanging, well, it wasn't his neck on the line. A rope was fetched, a noose tied, and the girl was shoved forward, her hands bound tight. She didn't scream, she didn't plead, she just stared at them with a look none of them would forget. Some later swore her eyes were cold as steel. Others said they saw tears, though the dust made it hard to tell. The signal was given, the rope jerked tight, her body thrashed once, twice, then hung limp in the still evening air. A hush fell over the crowd, a few muttered prayers, a few spit in the dirt. And just like that, the mob scattered back to their homes, convinced justice had been served. Everyone left. Everyone except one man. He wasn't a preacher. He wasn't law. He wasn't even from town. Just a cowboy passing through. The kind who kept to himself, drifting from one stretch of land to the next. Nobody knew his name, and maybe that's why the story lasted as long as it did. The nameless ones are easier to turn into legends. He stood at the edge of the tree long after the crowd was gone, watching the body sway in the twilight. The creak of rope against bark was the only sound left. Something about it didn't sit right with him. Maybe it was the way her head leaned too far. Maybe it was a whisper from his gut. Or maybe he just hated the sight of a mob deciding who deserved to breathe and who didn't. Whatever it was, he acted. He pulled a knife from his belt, glanced over his shoulder, and with one swift motion, cut the rope. The body dropped into his arms, lighter than he expected. She wasn't some hardened scout or thief. She was just a girl. For a long moment, he thought it was too late. Her face was pale, lips blue, eyes shut. But then, faint as a sigh, her chest lifted. A gasp rattled through her throat. She was alive. The cowboy froze. His heart hammered in his chest. He laid her down gently, tilted her head, loosened the mark of the noose around her neck. Slowly, her eyes fluttered open. Imagine that, pulled back from death itself, staring up at the man who'd defied the crowd. She coughed, tried to speak, but nothing came out. He tipped his canteen to her lips. Water spilled down her chin as she gulped it greedily. Life was creeping back into her, and that's when trouble started. A ranch hand, stumbling home from the saloon, spotted them. His eyes went wide. He bolted for town, shouting at the top of his lungs, "The girl's alive! That drifter cut her down!" Within minutes, the mob was back. Anger twisted their faces, louder than before. "You fool!" someone shouted. "She'll bring the Apache down on us." "You've doomed us all," another cried. The cowboy didn't budge. He stood tall, knife in hand, the girl still gasping for life behind him. He didn't need words. His silence was enough. The crowd pressed closer, voices rising, fists shaking. Some called to string her up again. Some wanted to shoot her where she lay. Fear made them reckless. Fear made them cruel. But here's a part no one realized, not yet. Out beyond the hills in the darkness just past their sight, riders were watching. Apache riders. They had tracked the girl. They had seen her swinging from the tree, and now they saw her cut down. They weren't gone. They weren't finished, and by dawn the ground itself would shake with the thunder of 200 hooves. For now all the town had was a girl who refused to die, and a cowboy who had no idea the storm he'd unleashed. The night after she was cut down wasn't quiet. It was the kind of silence that sits heavy, where every creak of wood and every coyote howl feels like a warning. Folks shut themselves inside their homes, lamps flickering, rifles leaned against the walls. Nobody trusted the dark anymore. In the saloon, though, the noise carried on. Men gathered around tables, mugs of whiskey clutched tight. Voices low and angry. Fear had turned into fury, and all of it was pointed at one man, the drifter. "You've signed our death warrant," one of them growled. Another slammed his cup down so hard the liquid jumped. "When the Apache come, and they will, it'll be because of him." But the cowboy just sat at the far end of the room, boots crossed, hat tilted low. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just sat there, watching the girl breathe slow and shallow beside him, her head resting on a folded blanket he'd laid out. Silence like that has a way of unsettling people. You ever notice? Sometimes words can calm a mob, but a man who doesn't speak at all makes them twice as nervous. By now, the townsfolk had started spinning new tales to justify what they'd done earlier that day. Some swore she was a scout. Others insisted she'd poisoned wells on her way through. None of it was true, but truth was less important than fear. Fear kept their hands near their guns. Fear convinced them she should have stayed dead. And here's where the real tension comes in. Fear doesn't sit still, it grows. By midnight, a few men whispered about sneaking in and finishing the job. Quietly, they said, so we don't have to worry. But every time someone got too close, the cowboy shifted in his chair. Not much, just enough. His hand brushed the grip of his revolver, and his eyes lifted under the brim of his hat. That was all it took. You could have cut the tension in that saloon with a knife. On one side, a mob afraid for their families, desperate to take control. On the other, one stubborn drifter and a half-dead girl. Finally, close to midnight, the girl stirred. Her lips parted, her voice no stronger than a whisper. "Nala," she croaked. "What's that?" someone asked. "My name," she said, her voice trembling, but steady enough to carry. "I'm not a thief. I'm not a scout. I was trying to get home." A murmur swept the room. Some faces softened, others hardened. Nobody knew what to believe. The West wasn't a kind place to strangers, and a name wasn't enough to wipe away suspicion. She told them she'd been separated from her people during a raid, wandering for days, half-starved and lost. She hadn't come to steal. She hadn't come to harm. She was just trying to survive. For a moment, the room went quiet. But fear doesn't let go so easy. One man spat on the floor. "She lies. Her kind always lie." Another stood. "Let's put her out. Let her people take her back. Then maybe they'll leave us be." But even that suggestion didn't sit right with most. They knew what it would look like, turning her loose after nearly hanging her. The Apache wouldn't forget. They wouldn't forgive. The cowboy stayed still, his shadow long in the lamplight. Finally, after hours of silence, he spoke. Just 3 words. "She stays alive." Simple as that. No grand speech, no fancy talk. But the way he said it shut the whole room down. The hours dragged on. Men slipped out one by one, heading home to sit by their doors with loaded rifles. Wives blew out lamps and whispered prayers. The night carried a weight, thick and suffocating, And still, the drifter sat, watching the girl, watching the door. That's the thing about him. Folks later said he had no stake in it. She wasn't kin. She wasn't his responsibility. He could have walked away like the rest, but something in him wouldn't allow it. Call it stubbornness. Call it decency. Call it a man's unwillingness to let fear decide what's right. When the first rooster crowed and the horizon started to blush with dawn, the quiet broke. At first it was subtle, a distant tremble in the ground, like the earth itself had a heartbeat. Then came the sound low and steady. Hoofbeats, not one, not 10, dozens, hundreds. Every man in town knew it instantly. They rushed from their homes, rifles in hand, children pulled close, women cried out, men cursed under their breath. The cowboy didn't move. He just pushed his hat back and helped Nala sit up, her eyes wide with fear, but not surprise. The sound grew louder, rolling like thunder across the plains. The dust on the horizon rose, and soon the silhouettes appeared. Riders, warriors, Apache, not 20, not 50, 200, painted and armed, their war cries tearing through the morning air. The town was frozen in terror. Every rifle shook in trembling hands. Every man knew the truth. If they charged, there wasn't enough ammunition in the whole settlement to hold them back. And the girl? She knew what was coming. Her father was among them, the chief himself. The drifter tightened his jaw, standing tall in the middle of the street, the girl beside him. He didn't run. He didn't hide. And that's where the story takes its sharpest turn. Because what happened next, well, it wasn't what anyone expected. The sound of hoofbeats at dawn is different from anything else. It's not like cattle moving. It's not like a wagon rolling. It's heavier, more alive, like the earth itself is trying to warn you. That morning, every man, woman, and child in town felt it. Their hearts raced in rhythm with the ground beneath their feet. 200 Apache warriors crested the ridge, painted for war, faces streaked with red and black, feathers whipping in the wind, rifles strapped across their backs, and spears glinting in the rising sun. The townsfolk had seen raids before, sure, a handful of riders slipping in, snatching a few horses, firing shots into the air. But this was different. This was an army. Men scrambled to their doorways, clutching rifles that suddenly felt far too small. Mothers pulled their children close, and in the middle of it all stood the drifter, his boots planted in the dust. Nala clutching his arm, her body trembling with both fear and hope. It's a strange thing to say, but in that moment, time seemed to stretch. The hoofbeats slowed. The air grew thicker. Every breath was a gamble. From the front of the riders, a single figure broke away. He rode a tall horse, its mane braided with strips of cloth. His shoulders were broad, his chest bare except for a necklace of claws and beads. His face, painted in streaks of black and white, carried an expression harder than stone. This was the chief, Nala's father. Now put yourself in his boots. The last time he saw his daughter, she was lost in the chaos of battle. For days he feared she'd been taken or killed. Then he tracked her trail, only to find her strung from a tree in a white man's town. Imagine the storm inside him, rage and grief so tangled he could hardly breathe. And now here she was, alive, standing beside a stranger. The chief's eyes narrowed, scanning the crowd. He saw the noose still dangling from the cottonwood. He saw the rifles aimed at his people. He saw fear carved into every settler's face. But when his gaze fell on the drifter, something shifted. Here was a man who hadn't run, who hadn't hidden, who stood calmly in the open, a protective hand hovering near the girl. The chief dismounted slowly, each movement deliberate. He didn't speak to the settlers. He didn't even glance at them. His eyes were fixed on his daughter. He called her name, voice sharp and guttural in the morning air. Nala stepped forward, her knees weak but her spirit firm. She answered him in Apache, words tumbling out quick, full of urgency. Nobody in town could understand what she said, but the meaning was clear enough. She was alive because of the man beside her. She was breathing because this stranger had defied the noose. The warriors behind the chief shifted uneasily. Some shouted in their own tongue, demanding justice, demanding vengeance. Their hands gripped their rifles tighter, their horses snorting impatiently. The townsfolk braced for the worst. If the chief gave the word, it would be over in minutes. Every man knew it. But instead of raising his weapon, the chief raised his hand. The warriors fell silent. The whole town held its breath. Even the wind seemed to pause, waiting. The chief stepped closer, his shadow falling over the drifter. For a long, tense moment, the two men locked eyes. The drifter didn't flinch. He didn't reach for his gun. He didn't say a word. He just stood steady, letting the silence do his talking. And here's the strange part. In that silence, something passed between them. A recognition, a respect, a shared understanding that both men lived by their own code, no matter the cost. Finally, the chief spoke again, this time to his warriors. His words were sharp, commanding, final. Nala translated for the settlers, her voice carrying through the stunned silence. No blood will be spilled today. A collective gasp swept through the town, relief, disbelief, and confusion all tangled together. They'd been bracing for slaughter, and now, nothing. The chief turned to the settlers then, his voice colder than steel. Nala repeated his warning. Harm her again, and not even the desert will hide you. With that, he mounted his horse, gave a sharp command, and the 200 warriors wheeled their mounts. Hooves thundered again, this time fading into the horizon, leaving behind nothing but dust and the pounding of hearts that had just tasted death and been spared. The town stood in stunned silence long after the riders vanished. Some dropped to their knees, thanking God. Others muttered curses, convinced the drifter had brought them to the edge of ruin. But no one could deny what had just happened. 200 warriors had come at dawn, and not a single shot had been fired. All because one nameless cowboy had cut a girl from the hangman's rope. And while the town wrestled with what it meant, the drifter, he just tipped his hat, turned his eyes toward the horizon, and waited for the next storm. But the story doesn't end with the riders leaving. No, the hardest choice was yet to come, because Nala had a decision to make. Stay among the people who tried to kill her, or ride away with the father who nearly brought war to save her. When the last of the hoofbeats faded into the horizon, the town was left standing in a silence so thick you could almost touch it. It wasn't relief. Not really. It was that shaky kind of quiet when folks know they've been spared, but don't quite understand why. Some dropped to their knees right there in the dust, crossing themselves, whispering prayers of thanks. Others leaned against walls, their rifles slipping from sweaty hands. A few muttered curses under their breath, blaming the drifter all over again. In their eyes, the man hadn't saved them. He'd brought the storm to their doorstep, but the drifter? He stood in the middle of that street, boots planted firm, watching the horizon until the last rider disappeared. Nala leaned against him, her breath steadying, though her eyes were still wide with something more complicated than fear. Because for her, the danger wasn't over. The warriors had left, yes, but her father's words still hung heavy in the air. Harm her again, and not even the desert will hide you. That wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. The townsfolk gathered near the saloon, voices rising in argument. Some said they should drive the girl out immediately, send her back to her people, make it clear she wasn't welcome. Others argued that would only bring the Apache back even angrier. Still others said they should keep her under guard. Hostage insurance in case the chief decided to return. The drifter didn't bother stepping into their quarrel. He just sat on the edge of the boardwalk, rolling a cigarette with slow, careful fingers. He let them spit and argue. He let their fears circle around them like buzzards. But when one man finally said, "She ought to hang again, just to be sure," the drifter spoke. "She lives." 2 words, flat and simple, but the kind that cut through all the noise. The crowd turned on him, anger flashing in their eyes. "And who are you to decide?" someone snapped. The drifter exhaled smoke, his eyes steady. "Man who cut her down, that's who." That shut them up. Not because they agreed, but because they couldn't argue with the iron in his voice. Inside the saloon, Nala sat quietly, sipping water, her hands wrapped around the cup like it was the only warm thing in the world. She was alive, yes, but her place in this town was more dangerous than ever. She asked the drifter in a low voice, "Why did you do it?" He didn't answer right away. He never was a man for long speeches. After a moment he said, "Because it wasn't right." She nodded, but the look in her eyes said she understood more than his words. In the West, wasn't right wasn't much of an explanation. It was a code, a man's private law. That night, the town couldn't sleep. Folks sat awake with rifles across their laps, waiting for a sound that never came. No hoofbeats, no war cries. Just the wind scraping against shutters and the creak of boards in the night. In that darkness, fear twisted into something else. Resentment. People don't like being reminded how powerless they are. The settlers hated that their lives had been spared, not by their guns, not by their courage, but by a decision made between a drifter and an Apache chief. And so whispers spread again. "He's no hero, he's a traitor. He'll bring the girl's people back on us. We ought to run them both out before it's too late." By morning, the town was split clean in two. Half believed sending Nala away would keep them safe. The other half believed touching her again would bring down the full wrath of her people. The drifter listened to none of it. He had his own plan, though he kept it close. When Nala asked him, "Will my father return?" the drifter studied her face for a long time before answering. "Only if you call him, or if these folks are fools enough to try again." She looked down, fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "They hate me. They fear you," he corrected. "Fear makes men crueler than hate ever could." By noon, a group of men tried to take matters into their own hands. 5 of them, rifles slung, stormed toward the saloon, determined to drag Nala out and finish what they'd started. The drifter was waiting. He stepped into the doorway, one hand resting on his revolver. His eyes met theirs, steady as stone. "You boys sure you want to cross that line?" he asked. The leader spat. "1 man against 5? The drifter shrugged. "One's all it takes. It wasn't bravado, it wasn't a threat, it was just truth, spoken plain. And the way he said it, well, it stopped them cold. They turned, muttering curses, but they didn't push further." Not that day. The town was boiling now, caught between fear of the Apache and frustration at the drifter's stubbornness. They wanted a clean solution, but the West didn't deal in clean solutions. And in the middle of it all was Nala, alive but trapped between 2 worlds. Too Apache to be safe in town, too touched by the white man's rope to return to her people unscarred. Her father had spared the settlement once, but the chief's warning lingered like smoke after a fire. If the settlers made the wrong move, the next dawn might not come so peacefully. The drifter knew it. Nala knew it. And deep down, so did everyone else. But here's where the story bends again. Because the next move didn't come from the warriors, and it didn't come from the settlers. It came from Nala herself. And the choice she made would decide whether there'd be peace or whether the streets would run red after all. The day after the riders left, the town wore a strange look. Relief mixed with unease, like men walking away from a rattlesnake without knowing if it was truly dead. Folks went about their business with quick, nervous glances over their shoulders. Horses were fed, shops reopened, children ran in the street again. But every sound seemed sharper, every shadow heavier. Nobody could shake the image of 200 warriors sitting on the horizon. Nobody could forget how close they'd come to being wiped off the map. But most of all, nobody knew what to do with the girl. Nala was alive, breathing, walking, talking again, and that in itself made her a problem. Half the town still muttered she should have stayed on the rope. The other half insisted laying a finger on her would bring her father's fury crashing down. And through it all, the drifter sat in his quiet way, rolling cigarettes, nursing coffee, saying little but watching everything. He'd tied his fate to hers the moment he cut that rope, and now he carried the burden without complaint. Nala herself wasn't blind. She saw the glares, felt the weight of the stares. She knew these people didn't want her there. She also knew her father's mercy wouldn't last forever. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in fire and gold, she asked the drifter the question that had been gnawing at her. "Should I go?" He looked at her, his face unreadable under the brim of his hat. "That's not for me to answer. But if I stay, she pressed, they'll hate me. They'll try again. And if you leave? He asked. She hesitated, because if she returned to her people, she'd return with a story. A story of hanging, of near death, of salvation by a stranger's hand. That kind of story carried power. Too much power, maybe. The truth is, the West wasn't just about bullets and blood. It was about stories. Stories were weapons as sharp as knives, as heavy as rifles. A story could start a war, a story could stop one. And Nala's story, whatever way she chose to tell it, wasn't just hers anymore. The next morning she made her choice. The town gathered, drawn by whispers. Men with folded arms, women clutching their aprons, children peeking from behind skirts. The drifter stood by her side, his face giving nothing away. Nala spoke clearly, her voice carrying over the restless crowd. She said she would leave, not because she feared them, but because she had no place among them. She would return to her father, to her people, and she would tell the truth, that one man in this town chose mercy, even when everyone else chose fear. There was a ripple through the crowd. Some scoffed, some hung their heads, some shifted uncomfortably. But nobody stopped her. Not this time. When she finished, she turned to the drifter. "Come with me," she said softly. Now here's the part where a legend takes root. He could have gone. He could have ridden with her, been welcomed into her people's camp, lived out his days as the man who saved the chief's daughter. But he didn't. He just shook his head. "Not my trail," he said, and that was that. The next dawn, Nala rode east toward the hills, her figure shrinking against the rising sun. The drifter watched until she disappeared, then saddled his own horse and rode the other way. West, always west. They never crossed paths again, at least not in the flesh. But their stories, those crossed plenty. Years later, around campfires and in smoky saloons, folks still told the tale. Some swore the drifter was a gunslinger looking for redemption. Others claimed he was a fallen lawman, running from a past he couldn't shake. A few said he was nothing but a fool too stubborn to know when to walk away. And Nala? To her people, she became more than a chief's daughter. She was the girl who walked through death and came back with a story that kept 200 warriors from spilling blood. In truth, nobody knew exactly what was said between her and her father that morning. Nobody knew what passed in that silent look between the chief and the drifter. That mystery was the marrow of the legend. But here's the part that matters. In a time when fear ruled men's hearts, one cowboy refused to bow to it. He saw a girl where others saw a threat. He chose mercy when the world demanded violence. And because of that, an entire town still stood. It didn't make him rich, didn't make him famous. He vanished into the horizon like smoke on the wind, leaving nothing behind but a story. And sometimes in the West, a story is more powerful than a gun. So when folks talk about the day an Apache girl was cut from the hangman's rope, they lean in a little closer, their voices dropping to a hush. They speak of the nameless drifter, the chief with 200 warriors, and the fragile line between peace and blood. And then, just as the tale ends, someone always asks, "Would you have cut her down?" That question hangs in the air, heavier than the rope that started it all. And maybe that's why the story lingers. Because it isn't really about her, or the drifter, or even the town. It's about us, about fear and courage, and the choices that carve legends out of ordinary men. The man who cut down the hanged Apache girl. The girl who lived when death had already claimed her. The dawn when 200 warriors rode and turned away. That's the story. That's the legend. And maybe, just maybe, that's the truth. If this story made you lean in, if it made you wonder what you would have done, then stick with me, because the Old West is full of tales like this. Some true, some half true, some just plain wild. Hit subscribe, drop a comment, and tell me, would you have cut her down? Because in the West, every choice could turn into a legend.